So my pitch for why focusing on perceived performance is smart and it's good is it represents better bang for developer buck, that we can make better, more observable, subjective improvements by focusing directly on the subjective than focusing on objective speed and hoping that the subjective follows suit. So in order to do that, we'll have to understand a little bit about the psychology of how people perceive time and how that works. So humans tend to break down activities between active and passive phases. Active phases are characterized by higher levels of mental activity. Passive phases are characterized by lower levels of mental activity. So everybody's heard the phrase, a watched pot never boils, right? This is an American idiom. It means that when you're bored and you're staring at a pot just waiting for it to boil, it can seem like time stretches on into eternity. And the data backs this up. This is true. Humans tend to overestimate time spent in passive phases by 36%. They feel 36% slower. And the reason for that is that the primary neurotransmitter associated with the perception of time is dopamine. So in states where you're not mentally engaged, you're not producing as much dopamine, time seems to stretch out. In times where you are mentally engaged or you are producing more dopamine, time seems to compress. So we do this every day. We divide our activities. Consider the idea of commuting to work. Sometimes or if you're driving to work. For those of us who live in the sticks, sometimes we have to do that. Consider sometimes you're on a side street, scooting along, actively, mentally engaged in the act of driving, and sometimes you're on a main arterial road, stuck in traffic and not mentally engaged, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for traffic in front of you to clear. And I know for me that this sort of passive phase of this activity, waiting in traffic, always seems to take longer. And this is the same on the web, too. So here's a little demo of me browsing Amazon for my next outfit. And you can see as I browse, I switch between active and passive phases. Active phases when I'm consuming content, when I'm interacting with the page, when I'm reading something, and passive when essentially I'm waiting for the next page to load. This transition does not happen immediately. It takes about 1 second for a user to make that transition from an active state to a passive state. So, psychology out of the way, what does this mean for us? We can really sort of do two genres of ways to do this. We can either keep users in an active state and do everything that we can to keep them from entering a passive mental state, or in times where end user entering a passive mental state is unavoidable, we can play some tricks and make some illusions that can make that time seem to pass more quickly. So, keeping users active. This is super important for short durations because as it takes 1 second for users to make a transition between an active to a passive phase, if we can get all of our loading done in that 1 second, we can keep them active and they never have any disruptions. They stay in flow. So we can do sort of 3 main easy things to help with this. 1, we can make sure that we don't tip our hand and go out of our way to tell users that they're waiting for something. We can make sure that we respond to users immediately, even if nothing is actually happening in the app. And we can change the event listeners that we use to be a little bit less conventional, but a little bit more responsive in order to get a head start on loading what we need to load. So first, let's talk about resisting the temptation to use loading indicators. And I know what you're thinking, right? Whoa, whoa, whoa. Slow down. Don't use loaders? No spinners? No progress bars? Isn't that what perceived performance is all about? And you're right, but before we learn how to use loaders, we need to learn how to not abuse loaders. So showing someone a spinner or a progress bar or some other loading indicator is a cue to users that they've entered a time where they have to wait for something. So what they're doing, if they're already in an active mental state and you're prematurely showing them a loader before they've naturally made that transition into a waiting state or a passive state, you're picking them up out of an active mental state and putting them in a passive mental state, which is having the opposite effect of what we want. It's making our app feel slower. So a good rule of thumb that you should carry with you always is only add loaders as your anticipated waiting time approaches 1 second. OK, so now that that's out of the way, we can talk about how to actually keep users engaged. Having an app that feels immediate and present and tactile is super important because users like to have the idea that they can maintain this two-way dialogue with the user, with the app. So it's like it's right there with them, and having an app that responds immediately to every user interaction makes it feel like that app is holding up its end of that conversation. The quickest and easiest way to do this is to make sure that you apply active states to all of your elements. Active states work just like hover states, except that instead of firing when you mouse over, they fire when you click or touch on them. They're implemented in exactly the same way. They work in exactly the same way. They're super quick and easy to implement, which is why it's so unfortunate that there are so many sites and apps that don't implement active states at all, because they're such a quick win.